Me too. It is going to be an inspiring video. Uh, if I was a DM, I'd take my inspiration away for that one. Give me that inspiration back. Hello there, adventurers, and welcome to Wally DM. Today I'm joined by Fred from the How to D&D channel, and we're going to talk about inspiration. In particular, the inspiration mechanic that is found in the Dungeon Master's Guide that the DM can give to their players for great role-playing or for exceptional and fun actions in a game. Thanks for joining us today, Fred.
Thank you, Wally. I'm going to enjoy talking about inspiration.
So what exactly is inspiration? Well, for those of you not familiar, inspiration is a mechanic in 5th edition where the DM can reward a player for actions in the game. Now, this is usually a result of like fantastic character portrayal with traits, ideals, feats, and bonds, or it can be awarded for compelling roleplay, clever thinking, or doing something like outside of the box in a game. If a player does something memorable, fun, or exciting, then inspiration can be granted. Now, if you have inspiration, you can expend it when you make an attack roll, saving throw, or ability check, and spending your inspiration gives you advantage on that roll. Now, per the 5th edition rulebook, inspiration does not stack, meaning you either have it or you don't. Also, rather than expending your inspiration for your own role, you could choose to give it to a fellow player that does something to contribute to the story in a fun and interesting way.
Can I just say, Wally, one of the things I have always struggled with, and I think my players have struggled with, is what is inspiration. And I mean, when you first look at it, it looks like it's a role play reward, for role playing by the players to get them engaged. It's a reward of doing something. And you can apply actually advantage and disadvantage to any kind of D20 roll.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be the player's role, it could be one of the other players at the table. They can apply advantage or disadvantage to another player's role if they choose to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really, really wonderful. But most of the time, I forget, and my players forget this. And what I find even more frustrating with the mechanic for inspiration is how you qualify. And on page 125 of the player's handbook, it actually states that you get it for role playing, ideals, bonds, flaws, personality traits, but it stipulates one particular part, which is always a sticky block for me. And that is that you have to, as a player, create a drawback for your player character. So you have to do something that's suboptimal or going to actually be a disadvantage to you. I don't mean the disadvantage mechanic. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that isn't going to be very useful to the party. So in other words, you're doing something suboptimal. There's a problem with that because I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I find that most of the players at my table can't stand the rationale behind that because they look at it and they say, so hang on, I have to do something to actually get inspiration so I can have either advantage or disadvantage. I have to do something with my character that would actually mess up my character or the party and make things more difficult so that I can potentially maybe get a better chance of rolling better on a D20 roll. And they just look at me and they never do it.
Well, since you put it that way, I mean, yeah, but you're exactly right. I actually read about inspiration for the first time out of my 5th edition book, and I did read exactly that. And it is crazy to think that way. That by doing something that's would it be in character though? I mean, if you did that, let's
It's
say, oh, go ahead.
it's definitely in character. The
Yeah.
idea is that you're following your
Mm-hmm.
traits, your bonds, your flaws, but in particular your flaws.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but you've got to do something that is suboptimal, that isn't really going to be very useful to that situation to be able to be getting that inspiration dice roll.
Yeah.
So as a result, people don't want to do it.
Well, I don't blame them. That's yeah, absolutely. So I think with that, at least as far as my DMing goes, is I read inspiration as far as the mechanic as the DM gives a die or inspiration to a player. And I think I've kind of just I don't want to, maybe I do want to say that, is just kind of homebrewed the conditions for giving inspiration. Because, again, this was probably the first time that I've read it in the book, but I've done inspiration for the last 2 or 3 years. And I always thought, giving inspiration for something that was really cool or a great role playing moment was one of the things that I always thought was a good reason to give inspiration. Take, for example, if you're sitting around a table and usually everyone's like eating out of a bag of chips, taking a drink, they're on their phone, they're doodling doodly doos on their notebook or whatever. But if a player comes through with a role playing performance that's so awesome that the guy quit chewing, he's like eating chips, he quits chewing to pay attention. The other people are off their phone and everybody just zeroed in on him. That would be like a perfect opportunity. Like, you get inspiration for that point.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So with that being said, let's look at inspiration. As a dungeon master, Fred, how often would you give out inspiration? Would you be stingy with it? Would you be generous with it? Somewhere in the middle? What would you do as a DM?
So for me, inspiration is very problematic. And in terms of how often I would give it out, I run sessions that are usually between 2.5 to 3 hours long. So they're not that long, they're pretty short. If I was running longer sessions, I would probably give out more inspiration if the opportunity arose. And it's actually, I feel like it's not actually a product of what I'm doing as a dungeon master. It's a product of what the players are doing. And so, I mean, you could give it out once every session. You could give it out multiple times. There's really no set fixed rule for this. I feel like it's actually down to the players. Because here's the thing with inspiration. The idea is that once the players get inspiration, they have to use it before you can award them more inspiration. And here's my biggest issue is that a lot of players will hang on to inspiration or forget about it. And so you can't actually award them more inspiration until they've done something else. So I don't feel like it's like, how long is a piece of string?
Fred, I think you were looking at my notes because that's exactly what I had written down there as well. It's like, yeah, the problems that could arise from inspiration, that is definitely dead set. Number one is, I know as a player, I'm hoarding that thing because I don't, if it comes down to a death save against a Medusa, I want to have that inspiration available. Do I care if I charm the audience as a bard with a performance roll and I want to use my inspiration for that? No, I'm saving that thing for when it matters. And I think you're exactly right. And as a DM, I've DM'd games where I want to give players another inspiration die for what they've done, but they're already sitting there with one. So it's and according to the rules, and I don't like to stack inspiration anyway, I have to wait until they use it before I can award it to them again. All right, so Fred, I was reading through there on inspiration, and it doesn't say how long it lasts. I mean, is it just for the session? Is it like game time? Does it last until they use it? What's your opinion on that?
So in terms of how long does inspiration last, I usually stick to, you have to use it in the session. But I am aware of dungeon masters who allow their players to bank inspiration. And so therefore they could have 5 inspiration points they could spend at some time.
Oh, wow.
I don't do that because I can see really significant issues with that occurring. But the other issue, I think, and probably why people allow banking of inspiration and don't require it to be all used up in that particular session, is what happens if your player decides to do something that you want to award inspiration for, and you have 5 or 15 minutes left of playtime and there's no dice roll involved in the next 15 to 5 minutes.
That makes sense.
What do you do?
Yeah, so it makes sense more in that scenario if you could at least have it carry over into the next session. And now I kind of understand why it's on the characters on the player character sheet. You can see where inspiration's on there. They fill it in, and then maybe that way they can remember for the next game. Or if you're the DM that allows it to carry over until they use it, then they always have that reference.
So I guess in terms of the designers, they've always said that inspiration only lasts for the game session. So if they don't use it, they lose it. So you've got to use it or you lose it. But I still feel like dungeon masters should consider this another one of those things where, well, how long is a piece of string? The piece of string and how long inspiration lasts is completely up to you, dependent on what you think is reasonable at your table, considering that if you award inspiration and there's no dice rolls the next few minutes before the end of your session, then it makes sense to give it to them next time. But you don't necessarily have to allow it to carry over the next time to the next session.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to allow banking in that way if you don't want it.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, inspiration, you can homebrew it. It's described in the player's handbook, but it's just so wonky as far as how to use it or things of that nature. So just do what's best for your players, for your game, and take it from there. So we kind of touched on this already, but just to pick your brain a little bit more, what are some problems that could arise from inspiration in your game?
Okay, so have a truck, like a big truck, because there's a lot.
Oh, no.
and it's long.
All
It's
right.
long. There's so much. So I'm going to rattle through all the things that I've come across in terms of my own experience. And that is players not using inspiration. They've got inspiration, they mark it on their sheet, and they just don't use it for whatever reason. Maybe because their rolls were all really good, or because the session wasn't that difficult, so they didn't feel they needed to use it.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't wind up having to eliminate disadvantage, so they didn't worry about applying their advantage to somebody else's disadvantage to get rid of that disadvantage, or applying disadvantage to somebody else's roll, which you wouldn't really want to do to another player because that would be horrible. So just people just not using it. And then you will know about this, dungeon masters forgetting to actually give inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
How many times have you forgotten? I have forgotten how so many times I've forgotten to actually give them inspiration
All the
because
time. Mm-hmm.
it's just another thing.
Yeah.
It's just another thing for dungeon masters to track. It just makes life even more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like it's a number you're tracking.
Mm-hmm.
You're tracking all of the personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws for every single character, which means you essentially have to have like a tag sitting over a dungeon master screen, or you've got to have all that stuff laid out in front of you with a table or a space that's already covered in stuff already. Or a screen that's already covered in information if you're using a computer screen,
Mm-hmm.
to try to track and remember, oh, they just did something that's related to their characters role-playing their flaw or their ideal, da-da-da-da-da. Like, tracking that's so hard. And there's more. There's more.
I was waiting. I was just like, that's only one or two, I think.
Oh, no, there's more. Like I said, it's a truck, so there's more.
Okay.
Then there's players not wanting to actually earn the inspiration for role playing. And this is very, very common because, as we already discussed, you have to do something if you go by the book
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how you apply it and award it. You have to do something that's a drawback for your character.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to do that. So I don't care about getting advantage or being able to eliminate disadvantage. So I'm not going to use that at all whatsoever. So we're just going to skip that. So they never actually do anything. So as a dungeon master, you can never award them inspiration because they never did anything to earn it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then here's the other one that comes up is dungeon masters decide they're going to try to fix the problem, and they allow banking of and I've already talked briefly about that,
Right.
banking of inspiration. And so what players will do is they'll bank it all up, and they'll have like 5-10 points of inspiration. They get to the BFG, the final boss, and nothing's going to go wrong now because they've all got all this inspiration. There's 5 people at the table. They've all got 5 to 10 points of inspiration, and that's enough to shift the battle completely. They don't have to worry about rolling 1s and 2s anymore because they're all going to be solved just like that. So banking inspiration's a big one. And I can't count. I mean, it's not just me as a dungeon master. I can't count the number of times that players have had inspiration and they have forgotten that they had inspiration. They didn't just not use it. They forgot they even had it.
Right.
So if I've got to remind my players because they forget and I'm forgetting to give them inspiration, you can just see how complicated that all gets. And, at the end of the day, is getting advantage or eliminating disadvantage from a dice roll a big enough reward or benefit for what you're doing with your character? And I think that is a big issue for inspiration. Just, is it good enough? Because it's still very, very wavy. You could wind up rolling advantage, and this has happened at my table.
Mm-hmm.
They roll one dice, they get a 2, and they're like, oh, but I've got inspiration. So they grab the other dice and they roll another 2. That's everything I've got, mate. I spilled my guts.
So I'm going to add on just a little bit. You've covered all of my problems that I would have. It. The only other one that I could even think of would be player favoritism. If some players get inspiration from the DM a little bit more than other players, you don't want to create that divide. So if you're going to use it in your game, you do need to make sure that you're fair with it. Players do have different ability levels as well, especially when it comes to role playing. There could be some players that are better at it than others. So probably one of the things that I would advise to, so that they don't think you're playing favorites, is to just make sure that you're fair about how you give it out. I don't have a truckload of ones like you did, though. But you did hit the main one, though, which was the not using it. And that happens to me all the time. And in fact, if the players aren't using it and forgetting to use it, and if the DM's forgetting to give it, do you even have it in your game? It's like it's not even there. So how about some creative ideas for inspiration? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, when we look at the player's handbook, there's not much. Mm-hmm. And as we've both said, neither of us like how inspiration is described and how you try to award it in the game.
Right.
And then if you look at the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 240 to 241, there's a whole bunch of information around inspiration as it happens. Okay. And it's really not that useful. Frankly, I was looking at it and I was thinking, yeah, okay, what have you said? You've basically said that if you don't want to use it, then don't use it if it's too much to track, and eliminate it from your game. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, I didn't really need you to explain that over a page or two.
Right.
Thank you very much. I could have done with something else, like how to run session 0. So all of things that I can think of all the things I've done and other dungeon masters have done, and whether you like what I spit out now, frankly, it's just about options as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. So you can give it out for players just doing something clever. I've done that. I've given out inspiration for them doing nothing at all. I've given them inspiration for just doing anything. If everybody is just sitting at the tight table and nobody's saying anything, you say, so what do you do now? And it's just dead quiet, and you're like, oh, this is going to be a painful session. And somebody finally talks, like, you're getting inspiration. You're getting inspiration. You're actually moving the game, mate, because I don't have to do all the work now. Role-playing drawbacks, I still dislike. I think role-playing in general, any of the stuff with regard to the player's character, mm-hmm. I enjoy that. When they engage in a conversation with the monsters rather than butcher them and take their stuff, that's always nice to see.
Yes.
So I will award them, and I don't care whether they're doing personality traits or bonds, ideals, flaws, or whether there's a drawback. I mean, if they're role-playing the character, that's good enough for me. And then a really big one, which one of my friends demonstrated to me, and I thought was brilliant, and really went to the crux of the game, mm-hmm. which is making the dungeon master's life easier. I'm all about that.
Yes.
And he said, I will give inspiration to you if you bribe me. If you bribe me, if you go and make me a coffee or a tea and bring it over here, I'm giving you inspiration. If you show up with a pizza or burgers for me to eat, or sweets and stuff that I don't have to bring, I'm giving you inspiration. So I think he gets a definite A+ for just making things that much simpler for any dungeon master.
They need a errata that in the player's handbook to say just that. Inspiration can also be given for beer runs or coffee breaks.
Yeah, beer runs, absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Now, A few of the ideas that I was thinking of, and a couple of them you already mentioned, and the big one I think is you can almost guide the players to a different type of a game, and as you said, instead of killing something, you talk to it, and that could, if you're having problems with players being murder hobos where they just want to attack and kill everything, and then one of them finally actually talks to a monster and they get through the combat without, or get through the encounter without combat, then they can get inspiration for that. You're kind of guiding them into not playing the game that you want, but maybe more of a diverse game where they're including all these different elements rather than just attacking everything. Now, one of the things I do miss as far as a creative idea is always to give out inspiration at the table. So when you play in person, I always had these two really big D20s and they always sat next to me, and I would actually be able to give that to someone and they'd have it sitting in front of them. So not only does everyone get to see that they got inspiration for what they did, but then it also reminds them, hey, I've got an inspiration die sitting right there that I can use in my game and I won't forget about it. And as a dungeon master, I've got these behind my screen and they're getting in my way. I keep knocking them around and I'm like, I got to give these suckers out because they're in my way. And I thought it was always just a neat way to interact, and of course that was back in the old days when everybody could play in person and stuff, and not so easy to do online, that's for sure.
It's actually made it much more difficult to give out inspiration because of all of the video chat and all of the online games rather than sitting at a table. Because I used to do the same thing because I knew I would forget. So when I gave it out, I needed to make sure that I would remember and they would remember. And that dice, giving them a dice, was a mental reminder for me and for them that
Yes.
they had it and they should be using it that session.
Absolutely.
But you can't do that online.
No, that's hard to do. Hard to do. I mean, I'm sure there's a creative way out there, so make sure you leave a comment below how you would do that. And then the last thing I want to bring up, because I kind of like this idea, is inspiration's used a lot for attack rolls, ability checks, saving throws, and things of that nature. But I really like the fact that if for some reason a character has, or a player has, one of these inspiration dice sitting in front of them and they fall to 0 hit points, of being able to, since they are inspired and have that inspiration, to just give that die back and they would actually just drop to 1 hit point instead. And that's just kind of something that I would homebrew into my game as far as inspiration goes. As far as if they got an inspiration die and they fall to the ground at 0, I'm going to throw them a bone and let them get back up, and it's just going to cost them the inspiration.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good idea. I think the other thing, and I think a lot of people might forget this, including players, and that is, when they're making a death saving throw,
Yes.
if they've got inspiration, is allowing, because it's a D20 roll, right?
Yeah.
So if you roll suck and you get like a 1 or a 2, a 1 would be really bad because that's like
That's
2 failures. Yeah. Being able to re-roll that would be really helpful. But your suggestion, and I think this is where like a totally new video is required, and that is all the different things that people do in homebrew inspiration, because anybody who's using inspiration has probably homebrewed it and made some adjustments, because as it stands, inspiration is forgettable. It is probably least useful mechanic that we have, and yet it should be a really useful mechanic, and it's not.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, the way that I read it, it's wonky. I can't think of any other word except for wonky to use, and it's just reading it. I scratch my head a little bit. I'm just like, yeah, I'll do it my way. Okay, so I think we've covered that fairly well. I do want to get some final thoughts, and especially, how do you do inspiration at your table, Fred?
So I've tried lots of different methods. And finally, in the end, I got so frustrated with the whole concept, particularly with video chat, that now what I do is I give everybody inspiration in the first 15 minutes of our game session, no matter what they do, just so that I don't forget to give it out. And then I say, okay, I've done my job. It is now your job to remember to use the sodding thing, because I've done my bit. It's been so difficult to figure out how to deal with all these things. And if you have a criteria for when you're going to give out inspiration, I just find that I forget that stuff. I'm thinking about monsters and what the monsters are saying.
Right.
And so now I deliberately, in the first 15 minutes,
Mhm.
I say, okay, and you've all got inspiration. And then I just leave it to them.
I'm going to go one step lazier than that, Fred. And and I was so surprised. I actually, when I read this in the book today, I was surprised to see it's actually an optional rule, and that is I let them give each other inspiration. Like, okay, this is the way we're going to do it. If one of the other players inspires you, you think they need inspiration, you've got to die. You just give it to them, and I just take myself all the way out of the mix.
I love that. It is awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so that's all we have for you today. That again is inspiration, a mechanic that DMs can use to encourage their players to play better role playing, or for fantastic things they do, or for playing their character the way it's written out on their character sheet. Once again, I want to thank you, Fred, for coming on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. It's a topic that doesn't seem to show up very much on YouTube for some reason.
Well, it's probably because we covered it all on one video, I guess. For those of you that are not following Fred on YouTube, you've got to do it. He has videos about everything that's Dungeons and Dragons, and a couple that probably aren't even about Dungeons and Dragons. He's got everything. In fact, he's the one that actually taught me how to play 5th edition. I binge watched all of his videos and live chats and things of that nature. So I will put a link in the description below, How to D&D with Fred Wheeler, and it is definitely worth subscribing to. So that's all we have for you today, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video. On to the next.